Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Mohamad Fakih, the owner of Paramount Fine Foods, has filed a defamation lawsuit against Kevin J. Johnston and Mr. Banerjee to the sum of $2.5 million. Mohamad Fakih came to Canada as an immigrant, struggled to find work, but instead chose to be a business owner. He bought himself his first restaurant. Since then, he's built a large franchise of Paramount Fine Foods. He's the CEO. He has hired over 1,000 Canadians and has been a strong advocate for Syrian refugees. And this is where the crux of the matter is. So aside from being a business owner, Mr. Fakih is an advocate for Syrian refugees. As an immigrant himself, he recognizes the beauty of Canada, the amazing opportunities that are here, and he's been involved. Particularly in 2015 with Islamophobes, a small boy who had drowned and washed up on a beach. One of the big principles in Islam is to practice what you preach. And this is what he did. He started hiring refugees. And aside from that, he's also been very generous. He sponsors interfaith dialogue. He's not one of these people that's trying to be some closet Muslim and hiding from the world. He's actually donating food and promoting dialogue between Muslims and non-Muslims. At the incident in Quebec in which 6 Muslim Canadians were killed and many more were injured, he offered to pay for the funeral costs. He's an individual who's very active in the community and really loves the blessings that he has in Canada, and he's trying to give back to the community. If we compare the stellar, from my perspective, a very stellar example in terms of being a Canadian citizen in Mr. Mohamad Fakih, if we go to the other side and look at the less than fabulous record of somebody like Mr. Johnston and Mr. Banerjee, we see that Mr. Johnston started the Freedom Report, an online activities that he uses and does in terms of promoting a lot of hateful and derogatory and slanderous comments against particularly Muslims, which is what this lawsuit's about in the first place. He's also recently been charged under Section 319 of the Criminal Code, under subsection 2 of the willful promotion of hatred. Some of the statements that Mr. Johnston has made, for example, Somalia is a place on the planet that needs to be destroyed. In fact, if we have biological weapons out there that we need to test on a particular populace, Somalia is where to do it. It was an incident, it's tragic, right now it's still under investigation, and we have no actual information, which is another issue that Mr. Johnston seems to suffer from. A lot of accusations and a lot of suspicion, but no real evidence to support his case. Now, Mr. Banerjee, he's a very close friend and an ally to Mr. Johnston. They are seen at a lot of the similar activities that they do, protesting, their online activities. Now, Mr. Banerjee founded 2 hate organizations, one known as the Canadian Hindu Advocacy and Rise Canada. His profile states that he is a renowned Hindu leader who is a director with Canadian Hindu Advocacy. This organization has promoted Hindu interests and values as well as organized rallies and events against Islamic and Khalistani Sikh terrorism. I'm not sure where the renowned Hindu leader comes from. I have not seen mass numbers of Hindu advocacy in support of Mr. Banerjee's activities. In reality, though, Mr. Banerjee uses his time online and offline to promote his view that he is superior because he's Hindu, which he's stated publicly. He also celebrates the death of Muslims and Sikhs. He posts misogynistic diatribes against women and aggressively attacks the LGBTQ community. An example of this, coming back again to Islamophobes, when he was found on the beach, Mr. Banerjee, as he was advocating for Hindu rights, had stated that, "Oh boo-hoo, tugging at heartstrings with a photo to pressure the West into flooding our nations with Muslim refugees. Who cares?" He further said, "Canada is infested with too many Muslims already. That little runted grow up and become a terrorist. No Muslim immigration." Mr. Banerjee also had said, "A dead Muslim is no big loss. In fact, this is a net gain for humanity." Remember, he's talking about a child here. These are the individuals and the attitudes of people that we're dealing with. Now, in terms of the lawsuit, Mr. Johnston says that he stands by his statements. Of course he does. This is what he does all the time. He makes ridiculous statements, and he's trying to use the freedom of speech laws to say, oh, look, he's going to play denial. Oh, I made a mistake. I didn't know, right? And that's part of the problem. He speaks without any evidence to support his case. Now, he claims that he's merely just questioning Mr. Fakih's conduct in terms of his business. So he's grown suspicious of the hiring practices in which Mr. Fakih has hired 80 Syrian refugees. And so Mr. Johnston said, I believe in a country, you serve the people of that country first. There are certain ideologies don't work worldwide. When did hiring refugees become something to be suspicious of? I mean, isn't that the complaint that so many of these individuals have? We don't want refugees coming to our country and living off the Canadian taxpayer dollar. So you get an individual now who says, I agree, people should not come here and just take advantage of the benefits and blessings of Canada. They need to be contributing members of society. So the way we do that is to give them jobs. Now, all of a sudden, this is a problem for Mr. Johnston and his allies. So I don't know when hiring Syrian refugees became a crime, but that seems to be part of the problem here. Now, as Muslims, one of the biggest principles, I love this so much, I love Islam so much because of these, the principles that we have as Muslims. Now, avoiding suspicion, for suspicion is the worst form of speech. This is something that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had said. Now, why is it the worst form of speech to be suspicious of individuals? Because it's not based on anything. It's just this idea of, well, I think something and I don't like it. So you start to spread rumors, you start to spread hate. And we have so many genocides throughout history that began this way. First, you start to attack individuals, make them look evil, make them look vile. And when you get enough support, you can start to do certain things that violate the very foundation of the country's, that it was built on, the laws of the land. Mr. Johnston doesn't have any evidence to his claim, but at the same time, he also wants to promote a particular agenda that has become very profitable for many people in the industry, the Islamophobic industry, especially the United States. I mean, Canada, we're not as big of a country, so I don't know if it's as profitable here, but it does get them a lot of attention. Now, the only evidence that we have in terms of this case is the mountain of evidence that is clearly all over Mr. Johnston's accounts as well as Mr. Banerjee's accounts, in which they clearly have a hatred toward anything that's Islam. You're associated to Islam in some form or another. If you are speaking and spending time with individuals, then you must be a collaborator. We have laws in our country for a reason. Freedom of speech is one of those Canadian rights protected by law that both Mr. Banerjee and Mr. Johnston love, but they do not really embrace these laws. They're only the ones that benefit them. We know this. Why? Because they are constantly resorting to defamation and slander, constantly talking about things that they have no evidence of, no knowledge of. Another incident for Mr. Johnston was he had made ridiculous claims without any evidence, which the police in Windsor had denied, but he still persisted that there was an arrest that had happened and it was a foiled terrorist attack that the news didn't want to promote. In terms of what I had said about following the laws of Mr. Banerjee and Mr. Johnston, how they like to use the law to their advantage, but it seems to be blowing up in their face. Muslim joke. As a Muslim, a very, very important principle is that freedom of speech is one of those rights that we have that's protected under law. In Islam, we agree with this to a point. We're not this kind of open bucket where you can just say whatever you want and do whatever you want. And that's what's beautiful about Canada, because Canada is very similar in that sense, in terms of what we believe as Muslims. There are boundaries. You can only go so far. Criticism of Islam is not criticism if it's not based on anything. People react emotionally and say whatever they want, and this is what's happening with Mr. Johnston and Mr. Banerjee. As a Muslim, I am required to adhere to the laws of the land in which I live. And one of the biggest principles that's mentioned in the Quran that is about bringing a society together and help that society flourish is adherence to the law. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, O believers, stand firm for justice as witnesses for Allah, even if it is against yourselves, your parents or close relatives. Be the rich or poor, Allah is best to ensure their interests, so do not let your desires cause you to deviate from justice. If you distort this testimony or refuse to give it, then know that Allah is certainly all aware of what you do. we're standing in a court of law. People lie, give false testimony, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, even if I have to testify against myself, meaning confess, if it's against my parents, my family, my neighbors, do not become unjust. This destroys any civilization, any society, when you allow people to behave in a way that violates the laws of the land. For those out there who are concerned about Sharia and all of these other concepts and ideas in Islam, inshallah we can address them in time. But if you claim to be Canadian and you truly love Canada, and this applies to Muslims as well as anyone who's non-Muslim, this means you have to adhere to the laws that govern this land. Canada is an amazing place and will remain so as long as we adhere to these laws. As soon as we start violating and breaking these laws, society falls apart. And this is why we have to put an end to these constant slanders and defamation, especially when they're targeting minorities because of their religious practice. And this is what this is all about. So may Allah protect us, keep us safe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.